Okay, I'm going to continue now with reciting sections from D.T. Suzuki's Introduction to the Lankavatara Sutra. But before I dive into that, I just want to make a comment on a video that I just uploaded moments ago, which was basically the unabridged recitation of the second part of the second chapter of the Lankavatara. And it basically goes through just a number of kinds of supposedly 108 questions that Mahamati is inquiring of the Buddha, and then the Buddha, giving responses. But it's really not, a very easy to follow or logical sort of Q&A kind of session. So for anybody who sort of slogs through that entire chapter, listening to it or reading it, I commend you. Because again, it's not the most straightforward or enlightening in my mind. But since I've committed to kind of doing it on an unabridged basis, I went ahead and provided that chapter to those of you that are interested. So the next section of the introduction is entitled The Ignorant. Life, as it is lived by most of us, is a painful business, for we have to endure much in various ways. Our desires are thwarted, our wishes are crushed, and the worst is that we do not know how to get out of this whirlpool of greed, anger, and frustration. We are at the extreme end of existence, opposed to that of the Buddha. How can we leap over the abyss and reach the other shore? So there's a lot in there. Of course, it's consistent with the First Noble Truth, the truth of dukkha, or suffering, or unsatisfactoriness. And he also then, in a sense, touches on the notion of the three poisons. He calls it greed, anger, and infatuation. Generally, it's referred to as greed, or the desire to pull things to us that we like. Anger or aversion, the desire to push things away from us that we don't like. And of course, ignorance in terms of our inability to see the nature of underlying reality, and in particular, the tendency to have the illusion of ourselves as a separate entity apart from the rest of the cosmos. And this notion of the other shore, of course, is, I think, a very classic and wonderful image where basically we're floundering in this sea of suffering, but that the other shore represents nirvana or enlightenment. And just to bring a free association to the fore, as far as, what was in the early Pali Canon, I think, is the notion that whatever vehicle we use to get to the other shore, and of course Mahayana recommends a great vehicle that everybody can get on board in order to accomplish that journey. But, however one attains passage, so to speak, to the other shore, you don't take that with you in the other shore. In other words, you abandon the raft or the dharma, the specific teaching that may have been very helpful to facilitate your passage toward the other shore, to facilitate your enhanced appreciation for the true nature of reality. But, keeping in mind that any conceptual system, any doctrine, any dharma in that sense is provisional, is a skillful means in getting us to the point where we realize that sense of oneness, I'll say, that represents kind of emerging with the Dharmakaya. So anyhow, Suzuki says, the Mahayana diagnosis of the conditions in which all sentient beings are placed is that they are all nursed by desire or attachment, as mother who is accompanied by pleasure and anger, while ignorance is father. To be cured of the disease, therefore, they must put an end to the continuous activities of this dualistic poisoning. When this is done, there is a state called emancipation, which is full of bliss. The Buddha's question is thus, how is emancipation possible? And here rises the Mahayana system of philosophy, which again, as Suzuki himself would emphasize over and over, is not truly a philosophy, but again, given that no conceptual system is adequate to completely and accurately reflect the nature of reality, we need concepts. We need verbal methodologies for pointing at least at the truth so that seekers can have some guideposts to follow. Now, the next section is a very important one called the turning back, or PARAVRITTI. To this philosophy, a special paragraph is devoted below. I wish here to say a few words concerning the important psychological event known as PARAVRITTI in the Lanka and other Mahayana literature. PARAVRITTI literally means turning up, or turning back, or change. Technically, it is a spiritual change or transformation which takes place in the mind, especially suddenly, and I have called it revulsion in my studies on the Lankavatara, which it will be seen somewhat corresponds to what is known as conversion among the psychological students of religion. It is significant that the Mahayana has been insistent to urge its followers to experience this psychological transformation in their practical life. A mere intellectual understanding of the truth is not enough in the life of a Buddhist. The truth must be directly grasped, personally experienced, intuitively penetrated into, for then it will be distilled into life and determine its course. This PARAVRITTI, according to the Lanka, takes place in the alaya vijnana, or all-conserving mind, which is assumed to exist behind our individual empirical consciousnesses. The alaya is a metaphysical entity, and no psychological analysis can reach it. What we ordinarily know as the alaya is its working through the relative mind. The Mahayana calls this phase of the alaya tainted or defiled, and tells us to be cleansed of it in order to experience a PARAVRITTI for the attainment of ultimate reality. PARAVRITTI, in another sense, therefore, is purification. In Buddhism, terms of coloring are much used, and becoming pure, free from all pigment, means that the alaya is thoroughly washed off its dualistic accretion or outflow. That is, that the Tathagata has effected his work of purification in the mind of a sentient being, which has so far failed to perceive its own oneness and allness. Being pure is to remain in its own selfhood, or self-nature, svabhava. While PARAVRITTI is psychological, it still retains its intellectual flavor, as most Buddhist terms do. So you can imagine that back in the day, back in 1979, when I had my own sort of spiritual awakening or religious conversion experience, I was highly drawn to the amazing, what seemed to me to be the amazing validity of this kind of analysis that, again, is consistent with what a lot of literature on mysticism contains, as far as a description of the kind of experience we can have as human beings, as far as getting in touch with a more transcendental kind of level of reality. A good book in that regard is the Varieties of Religious Experience, for anybody that's interested in it, a series of lectures that purported to study these kinds of mystical experiences. I'll do one more section here in this particular video, and this one is entitled Self-Discipline and the Buddha's Power. As long as PARAVRITTI is an experience and not mere understanding, it is evident that self-discipline plays an important role in the Buddhist life. This is insisted upon in the Lanka, as is illustrated in the use of such phrases as "do not rely on others," "strive yourselves," etc. But at the same time, we must not forget the fact that the Lanka also emphasizes the necessity of the Buddha's power being added to the Bodhisattvas in their upward course of spiritual development and in the accomplishment of their great task of world salvation. So this is what I think I was referring to at some point in my previous talk on Suzuki's introduction, that the Bodhisattvas are encouraged to be aware of and cultivate a sense of gratitude for the help of the Buddhas, and to recognize that they're able to do their work as a function of taking refuge in the Buddhas. If the Bodhisattvas were not thus so constantly sustained by the miraculous power of the Buddha, they would speedily fall into the group of the philosophers and Shravakas, and they would never be able to attain supreme enlightenment and preach the doctrine of universal emancipation. There again, Mahayana Buddhism being a system of universal salvation. Indeed, when the Buddha so wishes, even such inanimate objects as mountains, woods, palaces, etc., will resound with the voice of the Buddha. How much more the Bodhisattvas, who are his spiritual inheritors. The doctrine of adhisthana gains all the more significance when we consider the development of Mahayana Buddhism into the doctrine of salvation by faith alone. And here, of course, we're getting into his reference to the Pure Land Path. The power of a bodhisattva's original vows may also be judged as being derived from the Buddha. If the possibility of enlightenment is due to the adhisthana or prabhava of the Buddha, all the wonders that are to take place by the strength of the enlightenment must be inferred ultimately to issue from the fountainhead of Buddhahood itself. At any rate, the Mahayana idea of the Buddha being able to impart his power to others marks one of those epoch-making deviations which sets off the Mahayana from so-called primitive or original Buddhism. When the Buddha comes to be considered capable of adhisthana, the next step his devotees are logically led to take would be the idea of vicarious suffering or atonement. Giving power to another is a positive idea, while suffering for another may be said to be a negative one. Although this latter is strangely absent in the Lanka, the Gandavyuha, which is the last chapter of the Avatamsaka Sutra, I believe, where we have Samantabhadra's vows, as well as the Prajnaparamita, which of course are the profound wisdom sutras, such as the Diamond Sutra, the Sutra in 700 lines, the Heart Sutra, etc., that these sutras, the Gandavyuha, as well as the Prajnaparamita, are quite eloquent in elucidating the doctrine of vicarious suffering. According to this doctrine, whatever suffering one is enduring may be transferred on to another if the latter sincerely desires out of his unselfish and all-embracing love for others to take these sufferings upon himself, so that the real sufferers may not only be relieved of them, but escape their evil consequences, thus enabling them to advance more easily and successfully toward the attainment of the blissful life. This goes quite against the idea of individual responsibility, but really religious minds require this vicarious suffering for their spiritual life. So, of course, the way that this is fashioned as a doctrine, if you will, within the True Pure Land school is in terms of the story of Dharmakara Bodhisattva, who put forward great effort and presumably experienced a good bit of suffering in order to accumulate positive merit, good merit, which then served as a store of merit that could be transferred to us suffering beings, so that in effect we were not obligated to strive toward the working out of all of our own negative karma, but could sort of leapfrog over the potential negative consequences of that karma as a function of reliance upon him in the form of his ultimate Buddha form, which was Amida Buddha. So, I mean, this gets into a very interesting kind of side channel, and yet one that in many ways is the main channel, the main path that I think one is ultimately led to through the study and reflection upon Mahayana Buddhism. And of course, advocates of the Nikaya form of Buddhism, Theravada and the like, would argue that this is not real Buddhism, that this was developed later, which it was, around 100 to 400 AD, as opposed to the earlier forms of Buddhism that stemmed from the historical Buddha. But in any case, that's something that each individual needs to determine for themselves in terms of what path and approach seems to resonate most meaningfully within his or her heart. Just to finish off this section, to suffer or atone vicariously is still negative and fails to entirely satisfy our spiritual needs. The latter demand that more good must be done in order to suppress the evils which are found claiming this world for their own glorification. So the Mahayanists accumulate stocks of merit, not only for the material of their own enlightenment, but for the general cultivation of merit which can be shared equally by their fellow beings, animate and inanimate. So that's where he gets into what I was just talking about in terms of the Pure Land doctrine as interpreted by Shinran. This is the true meaning of parinamana, that is, turning one's merit over to others for their spiritual interest. Talk about altruistic, talk about profound. As I said elsewhere, this notion of parinamana is not at all traceable in the Lanka, which is strange. The Lanka cannot be imagined to have been compiled prior to the Prajnaparamita, nor to the Gandavyuha or Avatamsaka, which is the Flower Garland Sutra. If so, why this absence? How can this be explained? So he's going to go on in this introduction, but the bottom line in some ways is what I said earlier on in this series of talks, which is that the Lankavatara is a very straightforward sutra, more oriented toward the psychological and philosophical, even though the ultimate intent is the spiritual. So hopefully this series is of interest, and I'll go on with it as I have the opportunity to do so.